So what do you think about the debates that we've been hearing about so much lately? Who do you think has been winning the debates so far? Seems to me that the one who appears to be scoring the most points and apparently winning the debates will be losing everything in the not-too-distant future. The focus is on the debates. But this has nothing to do with anything happening in the secular world. It has to do, though, with last week's debate between the Pharisees and the Herodians, and Jesus' response in the midst of that debate: give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, but give to God what belongs to God. And also this week's debate with the Pharisees in identifying the number one issue, the key question concerning the most important commandment and where people's allegiance lies. Both debates were meant to be traps for Jesus. Jesus is scoring some points. At this particular point, he's winning. But he will soon lose. He will soon lose his life because his opponents will see to it that his message of universal love, of God and neighbor, isn't accepted. So today, again, like last week, we're in the middle of another debate. The scriptures are always timely. Isn't it interesting that the world always seems to love a debate? When two sides square off, whether it's across the family dinner table or in the middle of a staff meeting at the office or on Zoom nowadays, or on the stage of a political contest, a thrill, a tension ripples around the conversation in the room. Who will get the better of the argument? Will truth win out over clever rhetoric? So as the debate gets underway, some of us may harden ourselves against all evidence in favor of our predetermined viewpoints. Others might just discover a new openness to the opposing perspective and might change our minds, or at least or soften our hearts with some type of greater appreciation or understanding or insight. But it's interesting to note where this particular gospel passage falls in Matthew's gospel. From the time Jesus arrives in Jerusalem, the debate is on regarding his authority. And so how do they mobilize this debate? Well, they sort of use a tag team approach in trying to discredit him. First, the Pharisees and the Herodians test him about taxes last week. They represent two completely different perspectives. The Pharisees are the Mosaic law-toting people who despise the tax, who despise the Romans and the government and all the leaders at that particular point. But then, on the other side, is the profiteering Herodians, more in tune with the big government of Rome, who want to keep the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. So what happens? Well, the debate leads to a draw because the response of Jesus baffles both sides. Next up are the Sadducees. So this little part of it isn't in last week's or this week's gospel, but this gospel begins today after Jesus had silenced the Sadducees. So the Sadducees had come to him about resurrection from the dead, a doctrine that they totally rejected. Jesus argues biblically for resurrection, and he raises one better by casting angels into the mix. So the Sadducees don't buy anything about angels or resurrection. But the Pharisees believed, they supported life after death, and they also supported spiritual beings. So while the Sadducees go off to sulk and to plan Jesus' demise, the Pharisees are delighted. Jesus has divided his enemies and weakened the offensive, a classic military tactic. The happy Pharisees, now in today's gospel reading, now they pose this candid question to test Jesus, to trap Jesus about which is the highest commandment of all. Jesus proposes the commandment of love from Deuteronomy, which incorporates both the law and the prophets. So it's all in there. And so now to argue against Jesus would be to argue against their own platform. The Pharisees are trounced, and Jesus denounces both sides for their lack of sincerity. So what does all this bickering have to say? Well, people of goodwill don't begin in the spirit of opposition. Those genuinely aligned to the truth would listen to Jesus instead of setting traps for him in public contest. This sort of religious theater isn't what Jesus is about. He refuses to fall for the traps. He refuses to be boxed in. There's a bigger stage that he's yet to mount from which he can be seen for centuries to come, the cross and resurrection. So, not all of us belong on a debate team. Some folks may personally shrink away, far away from verbal sparring or open conflict. But we're all involved in the greatest debate of history, for or against God, for or against the gospel of life. Every action we take testifies to one side or the other. And that's kind of specified very clearly today in the first reading from the book of Exodus. So we're hearing Matthew's gospel. In Luke's gospel, when the same question comes up, Jesus defines the neighbor through the parable of the Good Samaritan. Today, Exodus reminds us by highlighting God's attentive care and concern for the most vulnerable among the people of Israel, the widows, the orphans, the aliens, those who have no voice. God hears them, and the people who claim to love God are responsible to concretize that love in service and attentive care for the most vulnerable and forgotten among God's people. And so likewise, for people of every generation, everyone, everything we value, and everyone we choose to love and care for, or to hate and ignore, everyone we love or care for or hate is another bit of evidence in our debates for our primary allegiance to who we are. The whole law, this gospel summed up in the last line, the whole law and the prophets depend upon our choices for or against love of neighbor. So, of course, the easier part for all of us is to love God. The harder part is always to put it into practice, and the way we put it into practice demonstrates where our hearts are.